What is the framework for interpreting eschatology? What does splitting animals in half have to do with the end times? And how is Jesus prophesied of during Abraham's time? All this and more. Welcome to the Brain Wire. Hello, my name is Nick, and welcome to the Brain Wire. And like the brains of Acts 17, we ought to examine the scriptures daily and to test what we are learning. Growing up, my family loved doing puzzles, especially the hard ones, like 500 or 1,000-piece puzzles. This is my favorite puzzle from growing up. My dad is an avid baseball fan, and I was as a result of it too. And it was also fun because it's a particularly challenging puzzle. Anyone who has put a puzzle together knows that the most efficient way to start is to find the corner and edge pieces and put them together. By doing so, you have created a frame for the puzzle. With this framework established, the interior pieces can be properly placed, which is still difficult to do at times, especially if you're not given the whole picture, like what is given on the front of the box. Now, with eschatology, we have no picture or cover of the box to know what it's supposed to look like. But what we can do is we can establish a framework for interpreting eschatology and to see how all the puzzle pieces of eschatology fit properly together. That way, we're not forcing prophecies together that should not be forced together. So what is the framework for interpreting eschatology? I'm going to make the argument that it is unconditional covenants. Now, what is a covenant? Well, at its core, it's an agreement, a contract, and this covenant is full of responsibilities of what the parties are to fulfill. Covenants can be conditional or bilateral, or unconditional or unilateral. Covenants were a very serious and sacred thing back in ancient times. People's reputations were at stake, and reputations actually meant something back in that time. And frequently, within making these covenants, you have these ceremonies that outline a symbolic imagery of what is to happen to each party should they break this covenant, as we will see later on. So why do these covenants have to be unconditional as opposed to conditional? Why do they have to be unilateral? It's because with unilateral, unconditional covenants given by God, it means that it's all of God and none of man. And also, the core focus of all scripture, all prophecy, is centered on the promise of the Messiah, of Jesus. Jesus is the core figure of most all prophecy. Now, what we'll find out is that certain unconditional covenants given in scripture all point towards the promise of a son, an offspring of the Messiah, Jesus Christ. And because of this promise, these covenants are necessarily unconditional because of this promise of a Messiah. And now these unconditional covenants that we find are the Abrahamic Covenant, and within that is the land covenant, 2, the Davidic covenant, and 3, the new covenant. Now, for this session, I'm just going to focus on the Abrahamic Covenant. Now, Abraham, or Abram at the time, was living in the city of Ur, which was part of the Sumerian Empire in about 2091 BC. And what's interesting is that Abraham's family probably were pagan worshippers because his father, Terah, or in Hebrew, Yera, is very similar to the Hebrew word Yereah, which is the Hebrew word for the moon god of the Sumerians, Sin or Nanar. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right or not. So you have Abraham's family that are most likely pagan worshippers, so they've lost this knowledge of YHWH since the time of Noah. And you don't see another YHWH worshipper until you meet Melchizedek, who is the king of Salem or Shelem or Jerusalem. So, back to the Abrahamic Covenant. This is first given in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. Now YHWH said to Abram, "Go from your land, and your kindred, and your father's house, to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you, and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." And later on in a few chapters, YHWH ratifies this covenant. So in Genesis chapter 15, verses 6 through 20, we read this. And Abram believed YHWH, and YHWH counted it to Abram as righteousness. And he said to him, "I am YHWH, who brought you out from Ur of the Sumerians to give you this land to possess." But he said, "O Adonai YHWH, how am I to know that I shall possess it?" He said to him, "Bring me a heifer 3 years old, a female goat 3 years old, a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon." And he brought him all these. cut them in half, and laid each half over against the other. But he did not cut the birds in half. And when birds of prey came down to the carcasses, Abram drove them away. As the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abram, and behold, dreadful and great darkness fell upon him. Then YHWH said to Abram, Know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. As for you, you shall go out to your fathers in peace, and shall be buried in a good old age. And they shall come back here in the 4th generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. When the sun had gone down, and it was dark, behold, a smoking firepot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces. On that day, YHWH made a covenant with Abram, saying, To your offspring I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. So we see in this passage, YHWH ratifies this covenant by going through the split animals in the form of a smoking firepot and a flaming torch. But did you notice something? It's only God that passes through the split animals, not Abraham. This is the first signal that this is an unconditional covenant. Only God is beholden to follow this covenant, because so far God has only said, hey, I'm going to do this for you. And so far, we have not seen God say, hey, you got to do this for me and I'll make this covenant with you. What God is saying by going through these split animals is saying, may this happen to me, being split in two, should I break this covenant? So I'm going to guess that this is an unconditional covenant because God is our promise keeper, our oath keeper. He will fulfill his promises. We sing and worship about this.
Promise keeper, light in the darkness, my God, that is who you are.
So, unfortunately, the topic of whether the Abrahamic Covenant is conditional or unconditional is rather a contentious, controversial subject. So I've got to spend a little bit of time here to make the case that this is an unconditional covenant. Now, one of the common arguments that this is a conditional covenant is a couple chapters later in Genesis 17, verses 1 through 2. I am El Elyon. Walk before me and be blameless, that I may make my covenant between me and you, and may multiply you greatly. Now, on its face, this seems to make it look like Abraham is supposed to be blameless and do these things, and then God will make this covenant with him. But the problem is, this was given 24 years after God ratifies the covenant in Genesis 15. And what we'll also find is that Genesis 17, the context of it is really talking about the covenant of circumcision. Now, that's not to say that there's not talk about the Abrahamic promise in between verses 1 through 2 and 9 and on, because in between, God does seem to be talking about the Abrahamic covenant and not the covenant of circumcision. And what we'll find out later on in Romans 4 is that the covenant of circumcision is really a sign of the covenant of the Abrahamic covenant. So, Genesis 17, 9 through 10 reads this. And God said to Abraham, As for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your offspring after you throughout their generations. This is my covenant, which you shall keep between me and you and your offspring after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised. So this is the greater context of Genesis 17, and really what God is saying, hey, be blameless before you, and I will make this covenant of circumcision with you. So I want to make the exegetical argument here that the covenant of circumcision does not add anything or annul anything from the Abrahamic covenant, just as the Mosaic covenant cannot add or take away anything from the Abrahamic covenant. Paul himself in Galatians chapter 3 gives us this exegetical argument. In verses 15 through 18, it reads this. To give a human example, brothers, even a man-made covenant, no one annuls it or adds to it once it has been ratified. Now the promises were made to Abraham and to his offspring. It does not say, and to offsprings, referring to many, but referring to one, and to your offspring, who is Christ. This is what I mean. The law, which came 430 years afterward, does not annul a covenant previously ratified by God so as to make the promise void, for the inheritance comes by the law, it no longer comes by promise. But God gave it to Abraham by a promise. Now this is an awesome passage because it gives us a 2-for-1. On the one hand, it proves that the covenant of circumcision does not add anything to Abrahamic covenant. Abrahamic covenant was freely given to Abraham by God. Abraham didn't have to do anything, but for the circumcision covenant, Abraham had to walk and be blameless before God, and God will make this covenant with him. But it does not add to the Abrahamic covenant, just as the Mosaic doesn't. The Abrahamic covenant, that promise, cannot be voided by man's doing. It is the everlasting promise of God. Now, the other point of the 2-for-1 is that it shows that Christ is the true seed of Abraham. He is the thread through all of prophecy and these covenants, as I was saying earlier. Now, I want to make one final point about the unconditional nature of the Abrahamic covenant. I had mentioned Romans 4 earlier, so let's go to there right now. In the first 12 verses of Romans 4, Paul is building the case of grace through faith, not of works. And he compares this to the covenant of circumcision. In verse 11, Paul actually says that the circumcision covenant is a sign of the covenant and a seal of Abraham's righteousness. And what this also shows is that Abraham is the father of all righteous people, whether they're circumcised or not circumcised. The uncircumcised is because Abraham was considered righteous back in Genesis 15, 24 years before the covenant of circumcision. So as Paul goes on further in Romans 4, from verse 13 onwards, he explains that the Abrahamic covenant is realized through faith and not of works. In Romans 4, 23 through 25, we read this. But the words, "it was counted to him," were not written for his sake alone, but for ours also. It will be counted to us who believe in him who raised from the dead Yeshua, our Adonai, who was delivered up for our trespasses and raised for our justification. Just as the Abrahamic promises were given to Abraham because of his faith, so has Christ's salvation come to us because of our faith, not of our works. Our faith in Christ's death, burial, and resurrection by his power and God's power is the substance of our faith, just as the substance of Abraham's faith was his faith in God's promises made to him. To say that the Abrahamic covenant is conditional upon Abraham's works and not of his faith is the same thing as saying that our salvation from Christ is based upon our works and not of our faith, and that's just plain heretical. So this is my case that the Abrahamic covenant is unconditional. Now, I want to return back to the Abrahamic covenant and deal with the specifics and outline the provisions of the Abrahamic covenant. Now, there are several other passages that I have not mentioned up to this point yet that further outline the provisions of the covenant, so I'm going to read you those right now. Genesis 13, 14 through 17. YHWH said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, "Lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward. For all the land that you see I will give to you and to your offspring forever. I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth, so that if one can count the dust of the earth, your offspring also can be counted. Arise, walk through the length and the breadth of the land, for I will give it to you." Genesis 17, 3 through 8. And God said to him, "Behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be the father of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham. For I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make you into nations, and kings shall come from you. And I will establish my covenant between me and you and your offspring after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and to your offspring after you. And I will give to you and to your offspring after you the land of your sojournings, all the land of Canaan for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God." Genesis 18, 17 through 19. YHWH said, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do, seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him? For I have chosen him, that he may command his children and his household after him to keep the way of YHWH by doing righteousness and justice, so that YHWH may bring to Abraham what he has promised him." And finally, Genesis 22, 15 through 18. And the angel of YHWH called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, "By myself I have sworn, declares YHWH, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of their enemies, and in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice." So now I'm going to summarize what the provisions of the Abrahamic covenant are from the verses we have read. So you can categorize the Abrahamic covenant into three different categories. First, you have your personal blessings to Abraham, your national blessings to Abraham's descendants, and universal blessings to all peoples. Within the personal blessings, you have many nations will come from him, kings will come from him, Abraham would prosper and be blessed, and he would be given the promised land. Within the national blessings, Abraham's descendants, the Israelites, are promised a national existence, the greatness of the nation, given the promised land, and the continuation of this everlasting covenant. And finally, the universal blessings, all nations would receive blessings through the physical descendants of Abraham. And what we've seen throughout the Old Testament and even into the New Testament and in modern times are partial literal fulfillments of the Abrahamic Covenant. They're not symbolic or allegorical fulfillments given in this covenant. They're literal. So for personal blessings to Abraham, most Middle Eastern nations can trace their descendancy back to Abraham through Ishmael and Isaac. David, Solomon, and Jesus were all kings that came from Abraham. Abraham did prosper and was blessed, and he did live in the Promised Land. For the national blessings, Moses, mostly through the diaspora in the 1st century AD, Israel existed as a nation, and since 1948 are existing as a nation even now. The greatness of the nation is shown in Deuteronomy and Joshua, as well as them giving the Promised Land through Joshua's conquest. And as we've seen so far, this covenant has gone through at least the New Testament times in a literal fulfillment. And for universal blessings, Jesus is the ultimate universal blessing to all people that has arisen from the Abrahamic Covenant. And the Bible was also primarily written by Abraham's descendants. There is so much more I could say about the Abrahamic Covenant because there's just so much in it and so much that is to be fulfilled. And I'm sure that I will cover that in future sessions here and there. But what I wanted to do was I wanted to just focus in on one of these components of the framework of interpreting eschatology, the Abrahamic Covenant. In the next session, I will dive into the Davidic and New Covenants to complete the outline of the framework of interpreting eschatology and to show the thread of the Messiah through the scriptures, through history, and through these covenants. So if that sounds good to you, please join me as I continue to put out new content as we dive into this amazing topic of eschatology. Like this video if you are happy that the Abrahamic Covenant is all a God and not a man. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so that you get notified when I'm uploading new content. Comment down below what you think, but please do so in accordance with the fruits of the Spirit. And finally, blessed is he who comes in the name of YHWH. Blessings and Maranatha.